Actually, I was thinking through Esther chapter 5, and it's a tale of two different parties or two different banquets, right? You have, in chapter 5 of Esther, you have Esther approaching the king finally and then throwing a banquet for him. And then after that, Haman leaves his banquet with Esther and goes out, and he has a little party of his own. He brings in his wife and his kids, or his wife and his friends, and so you get to compare and contrast the two different banquets. And what's interesting is you're not really comparing the banquets themselves or the settings themselves, but what they tell you about the characters that throw the banquets, right? So we learn about Esther that she's very humble and she's full of wisdom, where Haman is going to be somebody who is prideful and maybe even a bit foolish in how he lives life. And what we get to do is compare that to how maybe we live our life. So I'm excited about it. But what I really want to start out by doing is looking at something Jesus said about how the world is and how the Christian citizen or the subject of the kingdom should be. See, the world acts one way, and it would be so easy for us to just follow that direction, right? Because the road is wide and many go into it. But there is a way that Christians are supposed to be, an attitude that Christians are supposed to have. So actually, I want to read this is out of Matthew. And it's chapter 20 when Jesus says this, and we're familiar with it because I think it is turning into one of my favorite verses. It's definitely one I end up quoting a lot, which I don't know what that says about me. But in Matthew chapter 20, verse 25, Jesus is talking about what the citizens of the kingdom should be like, what kind of attitude, what kind of characteristics. And he's contrasting that with the world. And so verse 25, Jesus calls them together and says, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them." In the world, it's all about the authority and being in control and power, and it's almost like there's never enough. You just need more power. But Jesus says this in verse 26, "Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." See, Jesus kind of sets the stage for the difference between how we are supposed to live and how the world goes on living, right? The world's all about power and ruling and wanting more. And Jesus says, not so for you. Christians are supposed to be different. Christians are supposed to be the kind of people that are willing to become a servant, to lay their own life down. In regards to others, we're supposed to be more humble. And I think what we're going to see in Esther chapter 5 is that Esther embodies the Christian ethic, whereas Haman, he's just a product of the world. And we begin to question, which one are we? How do we live? Where do we identify with each one? And so looking at Esther chapter 5, just a couple reminders, like chapter 4 left us with a couple questions. Is Esther really going to go before the king? She knows that if she does, she might be put to death, right? Anybody who approaches the king without being invited might be put to death unless the king extends his scepter or welcomes them in. And so Esther is going a little bit afraid. But before she goes, she asks all the people, all the Jews in the area, to fast, which is this way of saying you should stop and you should pray, seriously pray over this for 3 days and dress in sackcloth. And I, being Esther, not me, but Esther said that she would also dress herself in sackcloth and fast for 3 days. So really what she begins to do is for the first time in her life, she begins to identify with her own people, right? Up to this point, she has hidden who she was, not revealing her Jewish heritage to anyone because Mordecai had told her not to. And for the first time, she puts on the sackcloth and she begins to fast and identify with her own people. But on the third day, she's got to do what she dreaded, what she was afraid to do, right? If she goes before the king, she might die, and she's accepted. If I perish, I perish. So in chapter 5, it says, on the third day, see the day's finally here. On the third day, she put on her royal robes and stood in the inner courts of the palace in front of the king's hall. So she takes off the sackcloth, the clothes that identified her with her people, and she puts back on the royal robes, right? The ones that identify her as the Persian queen, and maybe reminds herself of who she is, right? But the goal, I think, ultimately is to remind the king of who she is, because she's got to go into the unknown. Will the king accept her? Will he not? But she goes into the king's courts and she stands at the very end of the king's court, and he was facing her. So when the king saw Esther, he held out his scepter to her, which was his way of welcoming her into the court. And so he holds out his scepter, and Esther comes and touches the scepter. Her life is spared. I think maybe all of us with Esther could take a breath, he's actually going to accept her. She's not going to die for approaching the king. And so it seems as if God's plan is starting to work. But could you imagine what the king might have felt, or what all the nobles in the hall might have felt? Everybody knew the rule, right? If somebody approaches the king unannounced, they're going to be put to death unless the king accepts them. And so the king must have been left confused and maybe a little bit in awe and wonder of Esther, because whatever it is that she's coming before him must be a great need. Nobody would do this without first thinking about it. Nobody would approach the king unless they were in a dire situation. And so I'm thinking the king, along with all the nobles, are confused. What is it that she wants? It's got to be this big request. And so we find what the king says next. He sees her, and he holds out his scepter. And then in verse 3, it says, "Then the king asked, 'What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half my kingdom, it will be given to you,'" right? Now, how lucky is Esther? That's her moment, right? Up to half the kingdom. But what I want you to know is that that's not a literal statement. It was a way that in Eastern cultures you would say, I'll give you anything your heart desires. That's how we might say it in our words, right? I mean, think of Herod. When Herodias danced in front of him, he was so pleased at this dance that he saw her and he said, "I will give you up to half my kingdom." It wasn't a true promise. It was as if I said to somebody I really loved, I will give you whatever your heart desires. I love you to the moon and back. My brother says that kind of stuff a lot too, on Facebook to his wife, and I always look at it and say, yuck. But anyways, he's not really offering her that. But doesn't it seem like this could be the end of the story? Right? I mean, man, she's got Haman on the ropes. The king's happy with her. He finds a favor with her. He's pleased. And he sees her and he offers to give her whatever she wants. You would think okay, at this point, Esther's just going to lay it out, right? But listen to what she says. She doesn't. She says, in verse 4, "If it pleases the king," Esther replied, "let the king together with Haman come today to the banquet I have prepared for him." And that's the end of the first scene, right? She doesn't ask. It's like you had Haman against the ropes and then you backed away. You didn't ask. But the king is pleased and he says, "Okay, I'll come to the banquet." And so that right away he calls Haman in and he goes to the Queen Esther's banquet and she has this fabulous dinner. And then of course the king has his wine, right? And after the king had drank his fill of wine, he asks again, "What is your request? I'll give you up to half the kingdom," is what the king says to Esther. And she must have him on the ropes now. She must be able to get what she wants now, right? But instead of telling the king about Haman and his plot to kill the Jews, Esther says, "Will you come to one more dinner tomorrow night? And then I will tell you what my request is." I'm thinking about what the king might have felt about all this. I mean, here is this woman who risked her life to approach the king. Whatever she needs must be dire. But she's gone far out of her way to win the king's favor. There's this whole dinner, she must really have a big request if she's going to go through such drastic actions to get the king to say yes. And so when she denies him again and says, "Just wait till tomorrow night. I will tell you all of it tomorrow night." Could you imagine how frustrating that would be for the king? This woman, what has she got going on? What could be the problem in her life that she would risk her own life and then she would prepare this great banquet? And now she's not going to tell me anyway. She's making me wait till tomorrow. It's almost enough to keep the king up at night wondering, right? And so the king goes away. Everybody is kind of head spinning. The king can't sleep. We'll find out about that next chapter, of course. But as readers, we should have our head spinning a little bit too, because we know how dire the situation is. We know that the edict has gone out to kill all the Jews throughout the province, men, women, and children. And so, like, you would think that she was going to do something about this, and then she doesn't. It's like she misses her opportunity. And it's a dangerous thing, because think of all the dangers that could happen if Esther doesn't make her request right away. Like, what if Haman finds out that she's a Jew? What if he gets to the king first? It seems to be a little bit risky to wait. So we wonder, why did Esther wait? But Haman, he's the only one that doesn't seem to be leaving confused. In fact, in verse 9, it says, Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. That's like the book of Esther's code word of saying he's a little bit tipsy, right? He leaves happy and a little bit tipsy, but when he sees Mordecai, he's got to go through that king's gate. When he sees Mordecai and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. See, if Haman couldn't be honored, he at least wanted to be feared, right? And so that's where he ends up. He ends up seeing Mordecai refusing to bow down, not even showing any sign that he might be afraid. And Haman goes instantly from happy to angry because he's not getting the honor that he thinks he deserves. So he does what I think a lot of people do, myself included. He calls together his friends and Zeresh, his wife. Right? He surrounds himself with people who tell him exactly what he wants to hear. Right? Who can identify with that? When I'm not feeling like I'm getting the respect and honor that I deserve out in the rest of the world, I surround myself with people that'll just puff me up and tell me exactly what I want to hear. And so this is the second banquet in the story, right? It goes from Esther's banquet to Haman. And Haman brings his friends and he begins to just boast about all the things that he has, right? He boasts about his vast wealth. He's got so much money that makes him better than everyone else, right? He boasts about his many sons. In that culture, to have a lot of sons made you more prominent in the community. It was a status symbol. He boasts about his position as second in the whole kingdom. He is elevating himself. And what I find so interesting about this is he's boasting to people who already know all this stuff. Think his wife had to be told how much money he has? Do you think his kids and his friends needed to be told about how many sons he has? Don't you think the whole empire knew that he was second in command? He's boasting about things that they already knew. So he's not really trying to tell them something. He's trying to puff himself up, right? He wants pats on the back. He does tell them something that they didn't already know. He tells them about Esther's banquet and how he was the only one invited to Esther's banquet. And what is more, he gets to go to Esther's banquet tomorrow too, right? And that's the new information. It's so interesting because that's the fact that's going to end up getting him in trouble later. That's the source of God's deliverance, but it's the thing he's taking pride in now. And but all this, he can't be happy as long as Mordecai is sitting at the king's gate. He can't be happy as long as he knows there's somebody out there that doesn't give him the honor that he thinks he deserves. So his wife, great wife, she says, why don't you have a pole set up? And the pole is supposed to be, have a pole set up. This is verse 14. His wife, Zeresh, and his friend said to him, have a pole set up reaching as high as 50 cubits. That's the length of your forearm, right? It could be as far as 75 feet in the sky is how high this pole was going. And in the morning, have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself. The suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the pole set up. Right? There's the story, the tale of the two banquets. You see Esther's side of the banquet, and you see Haman's banquet, and they're very different, aren't they? You see not just the banquets themselves, but what they say about the people. One other thing that I think is really interesting about this chapter, really not saying a lot about any of my points, but in the beginning and opening of the book of Esther, the edict goes out that women are supposed to obey and respect their husbands. This chapter is the women leading their husbands, right? Like it's Haman's wife telling him what he should do, and Esther kind of bringing about God's deliverance. It's just kind of like God has a divine sense of humor, doesn't he? Like here it is, the opening of the book. Women, respect your husbands, obey your husbands, and here the women are the ones leading. Anyway, that's what I thought was interesting and funny about the chapter. But I want to get into my points. My first point is that Esther is an example of Christian humility and wisdom. Going back to that verse in Matthew, Jesus says, not so with you, right? In my kingdom, whoever wants to be greatest must be a servant, a subject, right? A servant. And he must be willing to lay his own life down like Jesus does. We see that kind of attitude out of Esther, right? I mean, in the very first verse of chapter 5, it says, she put on her royal robes and stood in the inner courts of the palace in front of the king's hall. Like, it seems like such a empty sentence, right? It's just telling us what she's doing. But she's taken off the dress of her people, the sackcloth that she was fasting and mourning in, and she puts on her royal robes, and she puts her life at risk to go stand in front of the king. I think if you look at what a Christian is supposed to be like, they are supposed to be the kind of person that puts other people's best interests in front of their own best interests. And Esther does that for her people. She willingly goes in front of the king, and her attitude about all of this is that if I perish, I perish. And I think that's the type of attitude Christians should have when being a servant. We always say joy, right? Jesus first, yourself last, and others in between. Esther valued the people enough to risk her own life to step in front of the king. Like that's the picture of what Jesus is talking about when he's talking about servants in the kingdom. Not only does she do that, but she also approaches him with humility, right? The king sees her and he stretches out his scepter to her. And it says, so Esther approached and she touched the tip of the scepter, right? Again, it's another sentence that almost seems like, well, she's just doing what she's called to do, right? She's just touching the tip of the scepter. But Scripture talks about how we approach people and how we approach people with humility. In Proverbs chapter 25, verses 6 and 7, it talks about how to approach the king. Here's what it says. It says, do not exalt yourself in the king's presence, and do not claim a place among the great men. It's better for him to say to you, come up here, than for him to humiliate you before his nobles. And you have seen with your eyes, what you have seen with your eyes, do not brag about hastily in court. For what will you do in the end if your neighbor puts you to shame? Like I went a little bit further than just verse 7. But did you see how it talks about how you're supposed to approach the king? Not with humility, right? Don't just go in there demanding your rights. Go in there and be a humble person. Esther was dressed as a queen, right? She's dressed as a queen. She could be the second most important person in the kingdom. Haman believes that he is, right? Of course. But Esther is the queen. But never once does she go in there and appeal to her status as queen to get what she wants. Instead, she approaches the king with tact. She stands in the front of the hall. She touches his scepter. She does the things that somebody would do with humility. Listen to how she speaks to the king. Verse 4, if it pleases the king, Esther replied, let the king together with Haman come today. Again, in verse 7, Esther replied, my petition and my request is this, if the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king, grant my petition and fulfill my request. She's approaching him with humility. Not only is she putting other people's best interest above her own, but she's acting with humility in how she interacts with other people. And then there's the fact that everything she does seems to make us scratch our head. Why didn't she just ask at the first place? And then the second opportunity, why didn't she ask then? And I think there's something about tact, finding the right opportunity. As we've gone through the book of Esther, we've noticed that the king seems to be easily influenced by his officials. At the very least, right? Like we're in chapter 5. As of yet, the king has made no decisions on his own. It's been the officials that have led him. So maybe she thought, I'm not going to get anywhere if I ask him in the courts when he's surrounded by people who might influence his decision. No, she needs to get him on her own terms at the banquet at her house. And maybe there was something at that banquet that said, maybe right now is not the best time to do this. Maybe there's a better time to do it. So she's patient. In Proverbs chapter 25, verse 15, it says this. It says, through patience, a ruler can be persuaded, and a gentle tongue can break a bone. Right? Esther shows herself to be somebody who puts others' best interests above her own. She approaches the king with humility, and she is patient in how she does it. That's the kind of person that Jesus was talking about in Matthew 20, right? That's the citizen of the kingdom, somebody who considers others above their self. Esther personifies that. And I think as we consider Esther, we might want to ask, because, it's important for us to try to identify with the characters. We might want to ask questions like, do I have that servant mentality when I interact with other people? Am I the most important person, or do I put other people's interests above my own safety even? You might want to ask when you interact with people, are you presenting yourself as the most important person in the room, or are you addressing people with humility? And then instead of just demanding things, are you handling things with tact, waiting for the best opportune time, right? There's some things that we can learn from Esther. She is a person that shows and demonstrates Christian humility and wisdom. But that's, of course, not the only banquet in the chapter, is it? We get the other banquet. Haman has his own party. And from looking at his party, we might be able to see somebody who handles himself is prideful and foolish. And that's my second point, is that Haman shows himself to be prideful and foolish. Right? You have Esther shows herself to be humble and full of wisdom. Haman, prideful and foolish. You see it from the minute he leaves Esther's banquet. Right? He's in high spirits, but the rest of verse 9 says, but when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate, he observed that he neither rose or showed him fear in his presence. That's Haman. If he can't be honored, he wants to be feared. Doesn't that seem like the rulers of the world? They lord their power over others. And if you're not going to give them the respect that they believe that they deserve, then they're going to at least be feared. Right? And that's Haman. He is so angry at Mordecai when he sees that he will neither bow down nor fear him. Although there is something to be said about Mordecai here too, huh? Like he's an example of courage. He's somebody who not only he continues to do what is right, but he also doesn't let fear dictate his actions. He's looking at in the face of his people being annihilated within the next 11 months. He still doesn't bow down. I think there's an example of courage in Haman. But Mordecai goes from happiness to rage. Have you ever gone like that quick? Right? Like his hatred for Mordecai is so much that he just can't see anything else around him. And so he does what many of us do when we feel like we're not getting the respect we deserve. We surround ourselves with people that tell us exactly what we want to hear. He has his children, his wife, and he begins to boast to them. He begins to be filled with rage, right, when he sees Mordecai won't bow. And then he calls his children or his wife and his friends, and he boasts about his wealth. He's got so much money, right? He boasts about his children and all the ways that he's been honored by the king. And now he's been elevated above the nobles and officials. What I like about this is it's showing the character of Haman. He's got plenty to boast about. Right? Look at how much money I have. Look at how blessed my family's been. Look at the status I have at my job. He's got plenty to boast about, but he's telling people that already know it, so he's just trying to build up his own ego in all of this. But still, even with that, if I look at Mordecai or Haman's life, and I see the money, and I see the family, and I see his position, and I have to agree, he's got a lot, right? If you were a person with lots of wealth and lots of children and a really successful job, shouldn't you be happy? Shouldn't you be content in life? And then what's even more is the things that they didn't know about. They didn't know that he had been invited to Esther's banquet. They didn't know that he was invited again the next day. But look at verse 13. I think verse 13 is kind of really important for us. It says this. It says, "But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see the Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate." He is so filled with hatred and pride that he can't even see the blessings in his life. All he can focus on is the hatred he has for Mordecai. I heard a statement this week that said, like, a coin pressed to your eye can block out the sun, right? And it was interesting to me because it's such a small coin, right? But you press it to your eye, and the sun is this big and awesome thing, and yet a small coin can block out the sun. And I think that might be Haman's problem. He has plenty to be happy about. I mean, he'll tell you himself about his wealth, his children, his social status, his job. He'll tell you all about it. But he can't even see it because he's so frustrated and full of pride and hateful for Mordecai. And I think that's truly sad. It should cause us to question some things about him. There's one verse I want to read, but I'm actually not going to read. I'll just quote it. It says, "Pride comes before destruction," right? A haughty spirit before a fall. And what I find so interesting about this text is the thing that he's proud of. He's been invited to Esther's banquet the next day. The thing that he takes the most pride in is the thing that's going to lead to his destruction. And that's how, I mean, if you know biblical wisdom and you know what the Bible says about pride and humility, you could have told me how the story is going to end before anybody wrote it. Because this is how God works. But I can't just look at Esther and say, am I like that? I have to also consider Haman and question, am I like that? Do I find myself as a person that's ruled by pride? I got to be honest, sometimes I do. Sometimes I like the acknowledgement and the people telling me good things. I like that, and I'm sure everybody does, but is that what becomes most important to you? Do I allow my pride to block out any blessings that I might have in life? You know, as a person, I have grown a lot in the time that I've been in this church, right? I started out in this church here, and I've grown a lot, like major accomplishments in my life. And if I had gone back to when I first started attending church, I had dreams. A lot of them have been fulfilled. But sometimes I forget about them because I'm so focused on the next thing. It's like that coin that goes over my eye that I can't see the blessings that are right there in my life. There are things that I have that I completely take for granted because I'm always out there trying to get more and more and more. That's Haman's problem. Part of it, right? He can't see his own blessings in life because of hatred, because of pride. It's blocked out, those things. I wonder about myself sometimes if that's true for me. Another question I might ask myself is, do I seek the approval of others? Is that what's most important to me? Do I want people to approve of what I do? I guess all I'm saying is that if we look at all the positive things of Esther and say we should be like that, we need to at least stop and examine Haman and see in which ways we act like that too. Because we're citizens of God's kingdom and we know how the world works. They lord their power and authority over others. Not so with you. My last point, and it's really fast because there's not a whole lot to it, is that even when things seem bleak, God has a plan. And the reason I point this out is because, Esther has waited. She had the opportunity. The king has promised up to half the kingdom. Of course, he didn't literally mean that, but up to half the kingdom. But she waited. She says, tomorrow, come to a banquet tomorrow night, and I will tell you my request. But what we find out is that when Haman's complaining to his wife and all his friends, they come up with a plan to have a pole set up as high as 50 cubits and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it, then go to the king's banquet or the queen's banquet and enjoy yourself. See, we're kind of in trouble now, right? Esther may have waited too long because her banquet is until the evening, and the king, or the Haman, is going to appeal to the king in the morning. And I think you could look at that and say, well, life is bleak. Esther waited too long. We're in trouble now. But the truth is, even when life seems bleak, when it seems like, man, there's no way we're going to escape out of this, God has a plan. And you guys get to see that next week, right? God has a plan. As we just consider this topic tonight, we get to see two different characters kind of described in two different banquets. Esther shows herself to be someone of wisdom and someone who demonstrates Christian humility. And Haman shows himself to be someone just like the world, full of pride and anger, so full of jealousy that he can't even see the blessings in his own life. As we consider that, you should consider, which one are you? Do you take for granted the things God has given you?